They thought the pressure would destroy you. The betrayal, the silence, the isolation, it was all meant to make you doubt your worth and abandon your path. But something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, you awakened. And now the same people who watched you suffer can no longer recognize the person you've become. Before we continue, take a moment to breathe. If these words feel like they're speaking directly to you, hit subscribe, like, comment, and share. There might be another soul out there who needs to hear this today. They truly believed pressure would eventually break you. That was the entire strategy from the beginning. Not one dramatic moment, not one sudden collapse, but a slow and exhausting erosion of your confidence over time. Every disappointment was supposed to weaken your spirit a little more. Every delay was supposed to make you question your purpose. Every betrayal was carefully positioned to convince you that maybe you were not as strong, gifted, or significant as you once believed. The people who underestimated you assumed your heart would eventually grow tired of fighting battles no one else could see. They expected loneliness to consume your motivation. They expected rejection to reshape your identity. And most of all, they expected your sensitivity to become your weakness instead of your power. What they failed to understand is that some souls are built differently. Some people are forged through adversity in ways that cannot be explained by ordinary logic. While others collapse under emotional pressure, certain individuals become more aware, more disciplined, and more spiritually alert through suffering. That is exactly what happened to you. Every painful experience sharpened your ability to see through deception. Every season of isolation strengthened your relationship with your inner voice. Every moment you spent feeling abandoned quietly taught you how to survive without depending on external validation. The very situations designed to empty you emotionally ended up forcing you to discover strength that had been buried beneath years of self-doubt. And that transformation confused the people who thought they understood you. Because instead of reacting emotionally the way you once did, you began observing everything differently. You stopped chasing explanations from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped begging for clarity from individuals who benefited from your confusion. Your silence became intentional. Your distance became protective. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, you started rebuilding yourself from the inside out. What frightened them was not revenge. It was your emotional detachment. It was the realization that you no longer needed constant reassurance to recognize your own worth. You no longer depended on applause to keep moving forward. The version of you they thought would collapse under pressure began becoming calmer, wiser, and harder to manipulate. That shift changed the entire dynamic. Because manipulators rely on predictable reactions. They survive by controlling emotions, insecurities, and fear. But the moment a person becomes self-aware, the entire illusion begins to fail. And while they were still expecting you to break apart emotionally, you were quietly evolving into someone they could no longer control, no longer confuse, and no longer intimidate. The trap looked perfect from the outside because it was built around the old version of you. But they never prepared for the possibility that pain would transform you instead of destroy you. At first, even you struggled to understand why life suddenly felt heavier than it used to. Nothing made complete sense. Situations that once brought comfort started creating anxiety instead. Relationships that seemed genuine slowly revealed hidden tension beneath the surface. People you trusted began acting distant, unpredictable, or strangely competitive toward you for reasons you could not fully explain. It felt like every time you attempted to move forward, something invisible pushed back against your progress. Opportunities disappeared at the last moment. Plans collapsed without warning. Doors that once looked promising suddenly closed in silence. There were moments when you genuinely wondered if the universe itself was working against you. The emotional exhaustion became difficult to describe because it was not caused by one major event alone. It was the accumulation of countless disappointments, subtle betrayals, unanswered questions, and internal battles happening all at once. Day after day, you carried pressure nobody else could fully see. What made the experience even more isolating was the fact that most people around you could not recognize the depth of what you were enduring internally. Some assumed you were simply overthinking. Others minimized your intuition because they could not perceive the spiritual and emotional shifts happening beneath the surface of your life. But deep inside, you sensed that something bigger was unfolding. Even during your confusion, a part of your spirit understood that the discomfort was not random. Your old mindset was being challenged. Your old emotional patterns were being exposed. The life you once tried so hard to hold together no longer aligned with the person you were becoming. And although that realization felt painful, it was also necessary. Over time, you began noticing patterns you previously ignored. You started recognizing how certain people only supported you when you were uncertain about yourself. Some individuals felt comfortable around the version of you that lacked boundaries because that version was easier to influence, easier to manipulate, and easier to control emotionally. But the moment your awareness began expanding, their behavior subtly changed. Conversations felt different. Energy felt different. You could sense hidden resentment behind fake encouragement and discomfort behind forced smiles. The more emotionally independent you became, the more certain connections started weakening naturally. At first, that loss hurt deeply because you cared sincerely about those relationships. You wanted to believe loyalty was mutual. You wanted to believe your presence was valued beyond convenience. But awakening often comes with painful clarity, and clarity changes everything. The struggle was not destroying you the way people assumed it would. It was transforming your perception. Every painful experience sharpened your discernment little by little. You became more protective of your peace, more intentional with your energy, and far less willing to ignore red flags simply to maintain connection. The version of you that constantly over-explained, tolerated disrespect, and chased understanding slowly began disappearing. In its place emerged someone quieter, wiser, and emotionally stronger. You stopped needing everyone to understand your journey because you finally realized not everyone was meant to walk beside you into your next chapter. And that realization became the beginning of your true transformation. The turning point began the moment you stopped reacting emotionally to everything designed to disturb your peace. Before that shift happened, people could easily predict your responses. They knew which situations would trigger your anxiety, which words would make you overthink, and which forms of rejection would cause you to question your worth. Your emotional openness, while genuine and compassionate, often made you vulnerable to manipulation from people who understood exactly how to provoke insecurity inside you. Some individuals depended on your emotional reactions because your reactions gave them a sense of influence and control. As long as they could affect your emotions, they felt connected to your energy. But what nobody anticipated was the day you finally became aware of the pattern. At first, the change was subtle. You began pausing before responding. Instead of immediately defending yourself, you observed quietly. Instead of chasing clarification after every misunderstanding, you allowed silence to reveal people's true intentions naturally. That silence unsettled many individuals more than arguments ever could. People who were once comfortable manipulating your emotions suddenly found themselves unable to access the same version of you anymore. They expected emotional chaos, but instead they encountered calm detachment. They expected desperation, but instead they encountered self-control. And for those who relied on emotional confusion to maintain power over others, your inner stability became deeply uncomfortable to witness. What transformed your life was not the absence of pain. The pain still existed. Disappointment still existed. Betrayal still existed. But your relationship with those experiences changed completely. You stopped interpreting every difficult moment as evidence that something was wrong with you personally. You stopped seeing rejection as proof of unworthiness. You stopped believing that every closed door meant failure. Instead, you began understanding that emotional maturity requires the ability to remain grounded even when circumstances feel uncertain. That realization shifted your energy in ways most people around you could immediately sense, even if they could not explain it logically. Your calmness became powerful because it was no longer performative. It came from exhaustion with chaos. It came from surviving enough emotional battles to realize that constantly reacting only drains the spirit. There is a different kind of strength that develops when someone has spent years learning how to regulate their emotions instead of being controlled by them. You reached a point where protecting your peace mattered more than winning arguments, proving your innocence, or forcing people to understand your perspective. And once that mindset fully developed within you, your energy became far more difficult to manipulate. Instead of begging for connection, you began valuing alignment. Instead of fearing distance, you accepted that separation sometimes reveals truth faster than attachment ever could. You no longer chase people who repeatedly misunderstood your intentions because you recognized that not every relationship was meant to survive your growth. Some connections were built around the old version of you, the version that tolerated confusion, ignored intuition, and sacrificed personal peace for temporary acceptance. But as your awareness expanded, those foundations started collapsing naturally. That is the moment you unknowingly became untouchable. Not because life suddenly became easier or because negativity disappeared completely, but because your spirit stopped depending on unstable people, external validation, and temporary circumstances for its identity. Your emotional strength no longer came from being accepted by everyone around you. It came from finally accepting yourself fully, even in solitude. And once a person reaches that level of inner stability, manipulation begins losing its power entirely. Many people misunderstand what real spiritual strength actually looks like. They imagine strength as something loud, dominant, or constantly visible to the world. They associate power with control, attention, status, or the ability to intimidate others. But genuine inner strength rarely announces itself that way. In reality, the strongest people are often the ones who have learned how to remain emotionally balanced while everything around them feels unstable. True resilience appears in the quiet moments nobody applauds. It reveals itself when a person continues moving forward despite carrying emotional wounds nobody else can fully see. Real power is not always found in aggression or confrontation. Sometimes it appears as calmness during betrayal, patience during uncertainty, and self-control during moments that once would have caused emotional collapse. Your resilience was not built overnight. It was developed slowly through countless private battles that nobody truly understood except you. Every disappointment forced you to confront parts of yourself that had previously remained hidden. Every heartbreak exposed emotional attachments you did not realize were controlling your peace. Every season of loneliness challenged your dependence on external validation. There were nights when your thoughts became overwhelming, when the silence felt unbearably heavy, and when the future appeared uncertain in ways that frightened you deeply. Yet even during those moments, something inside you refused to completely surrender. That quiet persistence became the foundation of your transformation. What made the process so difficult was that your growth often happened without visible rewards. While other people seemed to receive recognition, support, and opportunities more easily, you were learning lessons through struggle and emotional endurance. It sometimes felt unfair watching others move through life effortlessly while you constantly battled internal storms. But what you could not fully see at the time was that your spirit was being strengthened in ways temporary comfort could never accomplish. Pain was teaching you discernment. Delays were teaching you patience. Rejection was teaching you self-worth beyond approval. And isolation was teaching you how to hear your own inner voice clearly without being influenced by the noise around you. Over time, the experiences that once nearly broke you began reshaping your perspective entirely. Situations that previously triggered panic no longer controlled you the same way. You became less reactive, less desperate for validation, and less willing to compromise your peace simply to maintain relationships that drained your energy. Your emotional endurance deepened because you had already survived the kind of internal battles many people spend their entire lives avoiding. You learned that not every conflict deserves your response. Not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation. And not every person deserves unlimited access to your spirit. That is why your energy feels different now. People can sense the change even if they cannot explain it logically. There is a calmness in you that did not exist before. You carry yourself with greater awareness, stronger boundaries, and a quieter confidence that no longer depends on constant reassurance from others. The desperation that once came from fearing rejection has slowly disappeared because you finally understand that your value is not determined by who chooses to recognize it. You no longer shrink yourself to fit environments that cannot appreciate your growth. You no longer feel obligated to constantly prove your intentions to people committed to misunderstanding you. Most importantly, the pain that once threatened to destroy your spirit ultimately refined it instead. The storms did not erase your kindness, but they taught you how to protect it wisely. They did not remove your sensitivity, but they taught you discernment about where your energy should be invested. And they did not harden your heart completely. They simply taught you that emotional peace is sacred and should never be sacrificed for temporary acceptance. That realization changed the way you move through the world forever. What unsettles people the most is realizing they no longer have access to the version of you they once understood so easily. There was a time when your emotions were more available, your boundaries were weaker, and your desire to maintain connection often outweighed your need to protect your own peace. Back then, people could predict your reactions with accuracy. They knew you would over-explain yourself after misunderstandings. They knew you would repeatedly give second chances even after being disappointed. They knew your empathy would keep you emotionally attached far longer than it should have. And because of that, many became comfortable benefiting from your patience without fully respecting your value. Some consciously manipulated your kindness, while others simply took your emotional availability for granted. Either way, they assumed that version of you would always remain the same. But personal awakening changes a person in irreversible ways. The experiences you survived forced you to examine patterns you once ignored. You began noticing how often your energy was drained by people who contributed very little to your emotional well-being. You started recognizing how certain relationships only functioned when you were constantly sacrificing your peace to keep them alive. At first, those realizations were painful because they challenged the image you held of the people around you. You wanted to believe loyalty was mutual. You wanted to believe your efforts were appreciated with the same sincerity you gave them. But awareness has a way of removing emotional illusions, even when the truth feels uncomfortable. The biggest transformation happened internally. You stopped seeking validation from people who only valued you conditionally. You stopped feeling responsible for fixing every broken connection. You stopped over-explaining your intentions to individuals who had already decided to misunderstand you before listening. Instead of exhausting yourself trying to convince others of your worth, you quietly began redirecting that energy back toward yourself. That shift changed your entire presence. People who once relied on your emotional accessibility suddenly found themselves unable to reach you in the same way. Your silence became unfamiliar to them. Your distance became noticeable. Your emotional discipline became intimidating because it reflected growth they never expected you to achieve. Many individuals confuse kindness with weakness because they fail to understand emotional intelligence. They assume gentle people lack strength simply because they choose peace over conflict. But what they failed to realize is that your patience was never a sign of incapability. It was a sign of emotional depth. And once someone with emotional depth learns discernment, their energy becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. You reached a point where protecting your peace became more important than maintaining unhealthy attachment. You no longer tolerated disrespect simply to avoid loneliness. You no longer ignored red flags simply because you cared about someone's potential. You finally understood that love without respect eventually becomes emotional exhaustion. This evolution confused many of the people around you because they were still expecting access to the old version of you. They expected endless emotional availability. They expected you to continue prioritizing everyone else while neglecting yourself. But self-awareness changes relationship dynamics permanently. Once you truly recognize your value, you stop negotiating your worth for temporary acceptance. You become more intentional with your time, your energy, and your emotional investments. And for people who benefited from your lack of boundaries in the past, this transformation can feel threatening because it removes the control they once believed they had over you. Now your energy carries a different frequency entirely. You speak less, but your presence feels stronger. You protect your peace without needing to announce it constantly. You no longer feel pressured to explain every decision you make because your confidence is no longer dependent on external approval. The version of you that once feared abandonment has gradually disappeared, replaced by someone who understands that losing unhealthy connections is sometimes necessary for spiritual growth. And that realization is exactly what made you untouchable. Not cold. Not heartless. Just deeply aware of what your spirit deserves and unwilling to betray yourself any more simply to keep others comfortable. Now the same people who once expected your downfall are being forced to witness your transformation from a distance. Many of them genuinely believed the pressure would eventually break your spirit. They assumed the betrayals would make you unstable, the loneliness would make you desperate, and the disappointments would slowly destroy your confidence over time. Some expected you to become bitter toward the world. Others assumed you would lose yourself completely trying to gain acceptance from people who never truly valued you in the first place. But instead of collapsing beneath the emotional weight of everything you endured, you evolved into someone far stronger than they ever imagined possible. And that transformation unsettles people because it reminds them that pain does not always destroy a person. Sometimes pain awakens them. The storms you survived changed you in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone who has never experienced deep emotional isolation. There is a certain wisdom that only develops after someone has repeatedly rebuilt themselves in silence. You reached moments where you had no choice except to confront your fears directly. Moments where nobody came to rescue you emotionally. Moments where you had to learn how to comfort yourself, motivate yourself, and continue moving forward even while carrying invisible exhaustion. Those experiences forced you to develop inner strength instead of depending entirely on external support. And although the process felt unbearably heavy at times, it ultimately created a level of emotional endurance that cannot easily be shaken anymore. What makes your energy different now is not perfection. You still feel emotions deeply. You still experience disappointment, sadness, and moments of uncertainty. But the difference is that those emotions no longer control your identity the way they once did. You learned how to experience pain without allowing pain to define who you are. That is an entirely different level of healing. In the past, rejection may have caused you to question your worth completely. Betrayal may have made you feel unlovable. Distance may have triggered fear and emotional panic. But after everything you survived, you finally realized something powerful. Other people's inability to value you properly was never proof that you lacked value in the first place. That realization changed the way you move through life. You stopped shrinking yourself just to fit into environments that could not appreciate your spirit. You stopped chasing validation from emotionally unavailable people. You stopped sacrificing your peace simply to avoid being misunderstood. Instead, you began prioritizing emotional alignment, authenticity, and spiritual stability. For the first time in a long time, you started choosing yourself without guilt. And although that decision may have disappointed certain people who benefited from your self-neglect in the past, it saved your spirit from further exhaustion. The most powerful part of your transformation is that it happened quietly. You did not need public recognition to heal. You did not need everyone to understand your journey in order to continue growing. While people were busy underestimating your resilience, you were rebuilding your inner world piece by piece. You were learning discernment. You were strengthening your boundaries. You were releasing emotional attachments that no longer aligned with your future. And little by little, the version of you that once lived in survival mode began disappearing. Now there is a calmness within you that comes from experience, not illusion. You understand that life will still contain challenges, disappointments, and unexpected endings. But you also understand your own ability to survive those moments without losing yourself completely. That knowledge creates a different type of confidence, one rooted in self-awareness rather than ego. You no longer fear temporary loss the same way because you finally recognize your own resilience. You know what it means to rebuild after heartbreak. You know what it means to continue forward after betrayal. And because you survived those seasons, very little can emotionally intimidate you anymore. That is why you feel untouchable now. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because your spirit no longer depends on unstable people or fragile circumstances to remain whole. You discovered your strength in the middle of emotional chaos, and once a person finds themselves there, they become incredibly difficult to break. The same darkness that was meant to weaken you ultimately revealed your power. The same isolation that was meant to silence you strengthened your inner voice. And the same pain that once threatened to destroy your confidence became the very thing that awakened your true identity.